What's going on, guys? Scar coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video. Today's video, we'll be dialing it back a little bit. We're going to be kind of going back in the time machine, going to and talk about a few budget decks that have been popping up here and there in the meta as a whole. I feel like some of these decks are forgotten about just because we're always looking at the newer cards, and when it comes to Magic the Gathering, it's either you're talking about the meta or you're talking about the new cards. You're never really going back and talking about some of the older stuff. And I actually think some of these budget decks are actually fairly good. You guys can see kind of above me some of the decks we are going to be talking about today, but we're going to dive in each one, kind of talk about it, whether you're a new or return player. We can always talk about these budget decks and see maybe these are one of the decks you want to start out with other than playing something new from Kaldheim. With that being said, guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out the channel a lot. If you're new here, want to know post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But let's dive into each deck and let's talk about it. So this first deck up is essentially like a mono white aggro slash baubles deck. Essentially what we're trying to do here is we're trying to play like a couple creatures out on the battlefield. One for the added benefit of giving our creatures protection. Two for the other added benefit of we need to put the enchantments we have in the deck onto creatures we control. This deck comes in fairly cheap at a budget, and you know, this is one of those things that was pretty popular right before rotation, just because there's a lot of good enchantments that kind of pumped up your creatures relatively big, and you swung it for big damage. And I feel like after Throne of Eldraine hit and we kind of lost some of those key enchantments, I feel like this deck kind of fell off. But I feel like with the introduction of Kaldheim and looking at some of the newer cards that we have gotten, adding it back into this deck, I feel like we may have maybe something similar or something that could be just as good with these newer cards. With that being said, this deck, like I said, contains one rare, which is Lurrus. You don't have to play Lurrus if you don't want to, but Lurrus helps just in case our creatures get destroyed because he is our companion. We can add him from our companion zone, paying the 3 colorless mana, and then play him out for his full cost. And he allows us to get back converter mana cost spells of 2 or less from our graveyard once a turn onto the battlefield by paying their mana cost, which I think is definitely beneficial, especially when you start, you know, doing LC's Life Bounties and or Selfless Saviors. You can start rotating these guys in and out, you know, sacrifice them, make something indestructible, or protecting them from a particular spell of a particular color. The other thing too is if any of our creatures do die in the process of being on the battlefield and we lose our enchantments that are on them, we can always return back our enchantments because nothing in the deck is 2 or more, so everything is able to be reoccurred with Lurrus overall as a whole. And the deck list is pretty straightforward on what it's trying to do. We are playing, as you can see, just a pile of 1-drops and a pile of 2-drops, mixtures of creatures and enchantments. In the 1-drop slot, we start off with the Alcy's Life Bounty just for the protection. It is an enchantment itself, and it gives lifelink, and like we said, we can sacrifice it to, you know, give target creature or enchantment we control protection of a particular color from our choice until end of turn. Help and save our creature possibly from getting, you know, targeted removal and or not board wipe. Board wipe is going to do everything, but this will help prevent it from really being targeted by a particular spell. Next card up is a Battlefield Raptor. I feel like this is a card that kind of goes underneath the rug as being a 1-drop here, but it's a flying for a striker. Sure, it's no 1-drop 1/1 lifelinker, but I do think this is actually pretty good because it's a flying for a striker, which definitely helps. I think the first strike's actually pretty interesting here because this can become a pretty decent blocker because it can definitely block into some mono red hate, you know, being something aggressive that doesn't have a lot of toughness. Having that one, even having first strike, I think just helps protect the creature overall as a whole. Then we play some Fight as ones just to give target non-human or human creature we control +1/+1 indestructible in a turn, so we can use it in a spot situation if we don't have something like Selfless Savior or Alcy's Life Bounty, giving our creature indestructible so it can't get eliminated by a board wipe and or removal spell. Then we also go with Keymurch's Blessing, another 1-drop 1-cost spell that gives target creature +2/+2 until end of turn. If it's an enchanted creature or an enchantment creature, so essentially if the creature's enchanted or the creature itself is an enchantment creature, it gains hexproof and indestructible, so 1, then it can't be targeted, 2, it can't die by board wipe and or removal. So this is also another, like, you know, fail safe just in case our opponent tries to directly remove or and or wipe the board. Then we have Selfless Savior, yet again another thing that gives our things indestructible by sacrificing it. And like I said, a lot of these things we can always reoccur back from the graveyard, especially the creatures with Lurrus. So this is definitely one of those things. Once we start sacrificing these and throw them in the graveyard, we can always bring them back on the battlefield and be able to use their abilities again. Then we also got Sentinel's Eyes. It's a 1-cost enchantment aura that gives target creature +1/+1 and vigilance. So essentially this allows us to attack in aggressively and also, you know, not have to tap our creature down, throw it on something like even like our throw it on a Battlefield Raptor, and Alcy's Life Bounty, Selfless Savior, any of our creatures in the deck, we can swing in, not have to tap our creature down, and we can save it back for defense, which is definitely very good. It also plays into another card we have in our deck, which is actually the next card we're going to go over, and that is Solid Footing. Solid Footing is a 1-cost enchantment aura. It has flash, so we can play it at instant speed. So we can play it like at, we can swing in. If our opponent decides to block, we can then flash this on. And what this does is enchanted creature gets +1/+1. And then the second thing is, as long as the enchanted creature has vigilance, it assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. So what this does is there's certain cards in our deck that may have a little bit higher toughness, and this allows us to then use that as its damage instead of using its power. And you know, certain things like, you know, that 1 extra point of damage from like the Raptor is definitely going to be good, as well as, you know, it's going to get +1/+1 from various things. It definitely becomes, you know, a problem for our opponent because now our creature is going to assign their power that way. Then we got one cost Ginger Brute, which is an artifact. It's the only non-white creature in the deck, but the idea here, it's a 1-drop 1/1 haster. We can tap 1, we can make it unblockable unless a creature has haste that can block it. And then 2, we can also tap it for 2, tap it and sacrifice and gain 3 life, just in case we get into a pinch and we're starting to get low on life. We can always sacrifice it and gain that 3 life. Then we go into the 2 drops, which is another interesting spot here. We have 4 copies of All That Glitters. It gives our creature +1/+1 for each enchantment and or artifact we control. Our deck for the most part is enchantments and or artifacts. I think we only have the Ginger Brute as the artifact, but most of the other things are enchantments. There's a few enchantment creatures, so it definitely boosts this up a little bit. So this just makes our creature that much stronger. Then I added 2 copies of Giant Ox. I'm not 100% sure if I'm sold on this. It's kind of awkward, but it makes a decent blocker for 2 mana, just being a 0/6. But this plus Solid Footing and something like Sentinel's Eyes makes it definitely something very problematic for our opponent to deal with, because once you put those couple cards on this deck, on this card, it becomes an 8/8 vigilance that deals damage based on its toughness, so the power doesn't matter anymore. And now this is a big 8/8, possibly by turn 3, turn 4, depending on how good you are with mana overall, and definitely very problematic for our opponent. Then we got Ruin of the Sustenance. I'm just testing this one out. I wasn't 100% sure if I was 100% sold on it, but I like the idea that there's not really any card draw in our deck, and that's the one problem with our deck. We don't really draw after a certain point, so having an enchantment that actually allows us to draw a card, I think, is pretty good. It gives our creature lifelink, and as long as the enchanted perimeter equipment has lifelink, so essentially it just has lifelink. Lets us draw a card to replace it once we play it, which I think is overall pretty good, and we can also get it back with Luris. Then we got Transcendent Envoy. It's another enchantment creature. It's another flyer, but the benefit here, it makes all our aura spells cost 1 less to cast. So essentially all these 2-drop auras now only cost 1 mana, which makes us more mana efficient, allowing us to keep more mana open just in case we want to play multiple spells on the same turn, if not multiple auras, as well as leaving mana open possibly for that, you know, Keymaker's Blessing, Fight is 1, sacrifice an All-Seas Life Bounty, stuff like that. Definitely benefit. We only have 2 copies in the deck, but I think overall it helps. You know, once in a while if we get this on the battlefield. Also, it's flying, so if we get enchantments on this, it can actually fly over a lot of our opponent's creatures if they don't play a lot of flyers. So overall, pretty decent card there. And we also go 3 copies of Daxos Blessed by the Sun. And I think the reason why I like Daxos here is because he's another creature that is just because you know, he doesn't have a lot of power, but his toughness starts going up as we get more devotion. All our stuff has white devotion other than our Ginger Brute. So essentially we can also use him with our enchantments, and we can gain some life that way, whether our creatures are alive or whenever they die. And I just like this as another idea, as also opposed to Giant Ox, as kind of using either or as one of those things that just kind of have that little bit higher toughness that kind of goes up the more things be on the battlefield. Combine that with Solid Footing and Sentinel's Eyes, yet again another very powerful card. And because we're playing very cheap cards, we're not playing anything super expensive. We're only going 18 lands. That sounds kind of low, but I don't think we really need a lot of lands. You don't really want to draw a lot of lands with this deck, because when I think you draw a lot of lands, you kind of flood out and then you lose potency on how you can do. And I feel like there's a possibility that you can even cut this down to 16. I don't know 100%. I haven't done any testing, but I just think when you only have to play 2 lands, maybe 3, 4 lands at most, I don't think you need that many. But with that being said, I mean, this is definitely an interesting deck. It is very focused on what you're trying to do. You're just trying to pump up like 1 creature and make it very large, protect it as much as possible from any possible removal and things like that, and just try to hit your opponent as hard as possible, as quick as possible. Moving on to the next deck, this deck is actually one of those interesting style decks I feel like, you know, was very popular when Ikoria first came out, and that is Simic Mutate. Essentially, Simic Mutate is just a deck where you kind of like, yet again, it's another kind of like focus on 1 creature, with almost like an enchantment, but you mutate them, which is essentially an ability that you tap whatever the mutate cost is of a particular creature. We'll just go with this one. So we would tap the 5 mana, and we actually mutate this on top of if not or below that target creature. And whenever, you know, this creature mutates, it may trigger an ability. Like this one will produce 3/3 green beast tokens. We have other cards that will get lands out of the battlefield, cards that will bounce our opponent's spells back, cards that will help us draw cards. And then the big thing in the deck is then getting to like the higher end of the deck, which you get something like a Styrax and or an Archipede. These both cards will technically kind of overwhelm your opponent at this point. Styrax works in the way that whenever this creature mutates, exile cards from the top of your library into exile X permanent cards, where X is the number of times this creature has been mutated, and you put those permanent cards onto the battlefield. So essentially it gets any creatures and or lands. If you also have artifacts, you'll get artifacts onto the battlefield, and you don't have to pay a single thing for them, and they'll just be on the battlefield for free, essentially, depending on how many times the creature is mutated. And the thing that's interesting too is you can actually stack these. So if you actually put 2 Styrax on the same creature, this ability triggers twice, and that X will get filled in for how many times that creature is mutated for each Styrax trigger. And that's kind of like the thing. You're kind of like trying to focus mutating, you know, one or two creatures at most. Maybe disperse it to maybe 2 or 3. There is a lot of removal in the format, so this is definitely a tougher deck to kind of pull off. But we do play some cards that kind of help out the deck as a whole. And I'll kind of go over card by card, just kind of give you an idea of how the deck kind of like goes from like, you know, turn 1 all the way to turn 6, 7, and whatnot. So we start off with Snakeskin Veil. It's a 1 mana instant speed card from Kaldheim. Essentially, it's put a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control, and it also gains hexproof. So essentially, this is one of our cards that we kind of like throw onto a creature if our opponent's trying to target it directly, and we just give it a hexproof as well as giving it a +1/+1 counter, which I think overall is actually not that bad. Hexproof is great. I think for 1 mana instant speed, it's not a bad card overall. Then we also play Baby Godzilla or Poliwag Symbiote. It's a 2 mana 1/3. Makes all our mutate creatures cost 1 less to cast. And whenever we cast a creature spell, if it has mutate, we draw a card and discard a card. So this is kind of like our draw mechanic. So as we're mutating, we can start digging a little bit deeper into our deck, getting more things onto the battlefield. But the only downfall is we do have to discard. So if we start running low of cards in our hand, we'll have to start discard. We'll have to make choices of what we want to keep and what we want to discard. Next card up is Essence Symbiote. It's a 2 mana 2/2. And then whenever a creature we control mutates, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on that creature, and we gain 2 life. So this is another way to kind of gain additional life, because this is also one of those creatures that's cheaper that we can kind of target for a mutate, allowing this card itself to get +1/+1 and also allowing us to gain 2 life. So definitely a very good target as well for mutation. Then we play Ram Through because a lot of our creatures are very tough. We can actually use Ram Through as another removal spell because green and blue don't really have direct removal as like destroy target creature or something like that. So we're using this as like a fight spell, but not actually having to directly fight. It's just kind of targeting our power to target creature. Definitely helps us out there. Then we got the Glowstone Recluse. There's a 3 mana 2/3 spider with reach. Because I'm trying to limit the amount of rares and stuff like that, I could also play like something like Gem Razor, but I'm just playing along with cards that aren't really super expensive and common. I'm just focused on commons and uncommons for the most part, outside of like 1 or 2 rares maybe at most in decks. So I figured I just go with this instead of putting 2 Gem Razors, which is also a solid choice. But this one is whenever this creature mutates, we get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on this. So let's just say you put this on your Essence Symbiote, you're not going to get 3 +1/+1 counters every time the creature mutates. You're also going to gain 2 life as well. So you kind of see how this ability starts stacking up over each other. We kind of already went over the Trumpeted Gnar, which is a 3 mana 3/3. It's a great target for a mutate at 3 mana, just because its actual mutate cost is kind of on the expensive side, it being 5 mana. Whenever this creature mutates, we actually will get a 3/3 beast creature token onto the battlefield. So this is another way to boost additional threats onto the battlefield every time the creature mutates, which, like I said, it's a snowball effect. So once you start mutating multiple things onto the same creature, every time you mutate, you'll get like these additional triggers of things. Then in the 4-drop slot, we actually are playing Migratory Greathorn. This is kind of like one of our ramp spells in the deck. So whenever this creature mutates, we get to search our library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle our library. So we can mutate it for 3, especially if we have something like Poliwag Symbiote out on the battlefield. We can actually mutate it for 2, start ramping up pretty quickly, and it's a 3/4 for, you know, possibly 3 or 2 mana. Is definitely pretty cool, and just allowing us to ramp up is definitely pretty solid. Then we follow it up with a Parcel Beast. It is a 2/4 4 mana cost card. We can mutate it for 2 mana, which is actually pretty solid. It's a very cheap mutate. It's one of the cheaper ones, I think, that are just straight up cheaper before getting discounted, but it does cost a blue and a green. And then we can also use it. We can also tap the creature for 1 mana, tap it. We can look at the top card of our library. If it's a land card, we can put it onto the battlefield. If we don't, we can put that card to our hand. So essentially, it's you draw a card. If it's a land, you get to automatically put it on the battlefield. If not, it just goes to your hand. So for 1 mana, you draw a card essentially, and just get an additional benefit if it's a land card. Then we play in Dreamtail Heron. It's a 5 mana 3/4 flyer. The mutate cost is 4, but whenever this creature mutates, we draw a card. So just having additional card draw is actually pretty sweet. Then it gives our creature flying, so now our decently sized creature that has mutate now has flying, so it can fly over other creatures, and definitely swing in for some solid damage. And the card draw every time it mutates is actually pretty good as well. Then we get the Pouncing Shore Shark, another 5 mana card. Here it's a 4/3, but it does have flash, and then the mutate cost is 4 mana. But whenever this creature mutates, you may return target a creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. So essentially what we can do is our opponent can tack in, or they can go block, or something like that. We can put it on our creature, and then we just automatically bounce that creature back to their hand. And then every time it mutates, we get to do this ability over and over again, which essentially we can start, if we have a mutate card every turn, we can essentially lock our opponent into bouncing something back to their hand every single time we mutate, which is definitely very good. And also flash speed is pretty cool to kind of catch your opponent by surprise, because mutate hasn't, I don't think, been around in the current state of standard. I feel like we may catch a lot of opponents off by surprise because a lot of people aren't expecting mutate as a whole. Then into like the meat and potatoes of the deck, which is Suspicious Derricks. This is kind of like the big guy in the deck. This is like one of the key cards you want to hopefully ramp up into. It's a 5 mana card that's 6/6, but mutates for 6 mana. Can cost 1 less, so it can mutate for 5. Whenever this creature mutates, we exile top cards from our library until we exile X permanent cards. We don't really play a lot of non-creature cards or non-permanent cards in our decks, other than the couple spells. So we're definitely going to be hitting a lot of stuff. And then we exile, where X is number of times this card's mutated. So your idea is hopefully to put this on something that's maybe mutated through 3, 4, if not more times. And then we get to put those permanent cards onto the battlefield. So essentially, it's like a ramp, not just a ramp spell of ramping mana, it's also a ramp spell of ramping creatures onto the battlefield, which then starts to overwhelm your opponent because then you're starting to go wide. Overall, pretty good card there. Like I said, you can start stacking this ability, and then whenever this ability triggers, then it triggers for additional time. And yet again, you start digging through your deck, burning through your deck, and getting a lot of things onto the battlefield just to overwhelm your opponent. And the final thing up on the thing here is Archipelagor. It's a 7 mana 7/7, mutate for 6. Whenever this creature mutates, we get to tap up to X target creatures, where X is the number of times this creature is mutated. Those creatures don't untap during your controller's untap step. So we can use this as almost like if we're going in for like maybe lethal or swinging in, hopefully for lethal, we can mutate onto our creatures, start tapping on their things, and then swing in for, X amount of damage. Also 7/7 is pretty solid overall. The mana base is pretty straightforward. 8 islands, 10 forests. We got some Thornwind Falls for the tap land for the additional game 1 life, but to help us splash that additional green or blue if we need that for a particular card. And we also got 2 copies of Evolve on Wilds just to help us, in case we need to filter some mana and get the right colors out. This deck is overall pretty decent. It's definitely a very solid deck just because it focuses around a core mechanic. It's kind of like Mutate Tribal in a way, but definitely a very solid deck overall. Like I said, with a lot of removal in the format, I think this could pretty much hold up, but you do got to play, with the idea that if you do have anything like a Snakeskin Veil, you kind of have to play more defensively, just because, your opponent's going to want to try to target your things you're mutating on. But overall, I would definitely give this deck a try if you're looking for something in the budget range. So the next deck up on the list is, I don't think anything new overall, and I mean, Mere Rogues has kind of taken over being the mill deck in a way, but this is mono blue mill. So essentially, this is kind of like my version I kind of whipped together. But essentially, if you haven't seen this deck already, we're kind of using a couple cards here to kind of help us mill a lot of cards. And that card is Rune Crab, which is a 1 mana 0/3. It has landfall, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under control, each opponent mills 3 cards. So essentially, we try to just play lands hopefully on every turn. Essentially, if we have 1 or 2 of these, we start milling our opponent 3 to 6 cards, if not more, depending on how many we have out in the battlefield. And it's definitely a good card, a good trigger, whenever we play land, because lands are free. Then we also play something called Teferi's Tutelage. It's a 3 mana enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, we draw a card and discard a card. And then whenever we draw a card, target opponent mills 2. So we're trying to mill our opponent in one of 2 ways. We're trying to do landfall triggers, or we're trying to mill them by but whenever we draw a card, we penalize them that way. And sure, we have a couple other cards to just mill them straight up and outright, but these are 2 key main winning factors of the deck, and this will help us get to our opponent to 0 cards left in their deck as quickly as possible. We play cards like Merfolk's Secret Keeper. It's a card that's a 1 mana 0/4, but has the Adventure Sorcery ability that we can pay 1 mana and mill our opponent 4 cards, which is definitely very good. And you can then eventually play it for a 0/4 wall, which makes a good blocker. I added 2 copies of Merfolk Windwobber just for the idea that it has a draw card, and whenever it deals damage to an opponent, they mill a card. So it has kind of like 2 things working for us. And maybe in the early game, you can start dealing some damage, and whenever you want to really draw a card, fill up your hand, you can just sacrifice it and get that one additional card draw. It's not really a key factor, and like we're trying to hit our opponent down to 0 with this card, but I like the idea of kind of having both effects on it. So I split it with Overwhelm Apprentice, which is another 1 mana card. Enters the battlefield, each opponent mills 2 cards, and we then scry 2, so we can fix the top cards of our library, getting the cards we want onto the battlefield, and then mill our opponent as well at the same time. I got Frantic Inventory in the deck just because I think it's a very interesting card. It kind of synergizes very well with the various tutelage, just on the basis of, sure, at the beginning it only draws us a card for 2 mana, but every time we play more of them and they go into our graveyard, we get to draw an additional card equal to the amount of them in our graveyard. So for turn 1 it's 1, turn 2 it's 2, 3, 4, and then eventually you start, if you have 3 other copies and you play your 4th one, you're going to be drawing 4 cards for 2 mana, which is actually pretty good. And combine that, like I said, with the Fairy's Tutelage, it penalizes our opponent at a pretty cheap rate. We're playing Sweet Oblivion in the deck. We're playing 2 copies of it. It's a 2 mana card that mills our opponent just straight up 4 cards. But I think the idea here is, if we're playing against a deck that's also milling us and throwing things in our graveyard, I like the idea that we can escape it from our graveyard to exile 4 other cards and mill our opponent 4 cards. So I like the idea that this can help, thin down our graveyard, so we can prevent our opponent from taking advantage of us having, a decent amount of cards in our graveyard as well. The Fairy's Tutelage, I already kind of went over this, but like I said, it's kind of one of our other main winning mechanics in the deck for 3 mana. Definitely, once you start getting this out and then kind of hopefully setting up some draws in your hand, you can definitely start milling your opponent for big amount of cards, pretty quickly. Didn't Say Please, it's a 3 mana counter. Counter target spell, its controller mills 3 cards, so it's a mill counter spell all in one. We're playing some solid come-ins just for the idea that we can always foretell it and then set ourselves up, or we can straight up at least play for 3 mana and counter target spells. So I think it's a win-win either way. We have Behold the Multiverse. This is kind of a card I was experimenting with just because it's a new card from Kaldheim, because we can scry 2 and then we draw 2 cards. And I think this is actually pretty good. Something can be said if you want to play other cards in this slot, but I think this is actually pretty good because of the scry and then drawing 2. But overall, pretty good card there. I'm playing 2 copies of Sleep. Sure, this is one of those ones that are on the fence as well, just because it's not a card that's standard legal. Like, you can go to your local tournament and play Sleep in your standard legal tournament unless you're playing like best of 1. But I think because if you're playing this deck in best of 1 and you want something that kind of taps on your opponent's creatures, just because there's not really anything that's going to be like a board wipe or bounce spell that's on the cheaper side, and I think you get 2 of these from one of the starter decks. We're playing 2 copies of this just to kind of slow our opponent down if they're being super aggressive. And then we're playing 4 copies of Into the Story, and this is the card that is hopefully going to finish off your opponent, especially when they start getting their graveyard having 7 or more cards in their graveyard. Just because it goes from being 6 mana then to 4 mana, and you draw 4 cards for 4 mana, which is very good. And then combine that with something like Teferi's Tutelage, you then mill your opponent essentially for 8 cards when you draw 4. If you stack this with a couple of Teferi's Tutelages, this allows you to also look for more cards with Rune Crab and things like that. And the mana base is pretty straightforward. We're playing 20 islands and we're playing 4 Evolving Wilds. Sure, if you have them, you could always play also more Fabled Passages, so like Evolving Wilds and Fabled Passages, and also whatever islands that leaves you with, which would be like 16 islands, 4 Fabled Passages, 4 Evolving Wilds, just so you can try to take advantage of landfall as much as possible, because when you play Evolving Wilds combined with Rune Crab, you get the initial Evolving Wilds comes out into the battlefield, and you get the one with the land that you search for comes out into the battlefield. So definitely a good way to kind of stack, very excessive mill very, very quickly. And overall, this is, a pretty solid budget deck. You can always make tweaks based on what you particularly like, but if you're gonna play mono blue mill and you're on the budget, this deck is pretty solid on the most part. Now, this last deck here, wouldn't be a budget video if we didn't include this deck. This deck is actually fairly strong, and I think with the way the current meta is, I think it definitely can catch a lot of opponents by surprise, just because the way the meta is set up as a whole. A lot of people are playing very aggressive decks, or they're playing decks that take a little bit of time to set up, and this deck actually can overwhelm your opponent pretty quickly. And if you don't know what it is, it's this mechanic called Cycling. It's been around for a while, but in Ikoria, to get another Ikoria ability, they brought the mechanic back, and essentially the way the deck works is that we gain benefits from us cycling cards. So essentially we pay this 1 colorless mana on the particular card, and then we can cycle it, which essentially we discard this card and we draw a new card, which is actually pretty good. And there's certain cards that have benefits of us cycling cards, so like our early drops in the game actually all benefit from us cycling. So this card, for example, Flourishing Fox, it's a 1 mana Fox, that's a 1/1, but whenever we cycle another card, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Flourishing Fox. If our opponent doesn't deal with this early and we start stacking multiple cycles, this card can become very big and very problematic for our opponent, because sure, turn 1 it's a 1/1, but turn 2 it could be a 3/3 if not more. So that is one card there. Another thing too, if our opponent's playing very aggressive, we can play something like Draenith Healer. It's a 2/2 for 2 mana. Whenever we cycle another card, we get to gain 1 life. So every time we cycle a single card, we're going to gain additional 1 life. We have Valiant Rescuer. It's a 3/1 a card, but every time we cycle for the first time each turn, not just our turn, we get a 1/1 human soldier onto the battlefield. So definitely a very solid card there, because this can start pumping out tokens, either chump block and or attack aggressively into our opponent. We got Starter Development here. You may see cards of other colors, but we're really just focusing these cards for other colors just for cycling. So this is a 2 mana blue spell, but we're gonna use it for the cycling ability because it only costs 1 colorless. We got Draenith Stinger here. It's a 2 mana 2/2. Whenever we cycle another card, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So essentially, this is every time we cycle, we get to kind of shock our opponent for 1 damage. We have Go for Blood. If we can cycle it for 1 mana, if worst case scenario, if our opponent has something super aggressive, but our Flourishing Fox is very large, we can actually use it to fight target creature we don't control. But most of the time, we're gonna cycle it. Memory Leak, most of the time we're gonna cycle it. But if we did have black mana in the deck, we can make our opponent reveal their hand, and you can choose an online card from it. From that player's graveyard or hand, and exile it. So essentially, we get to exile target card from their hand or in their graveyard that's a non-land. Frostveil Ambush, yet again another card. Sure, costs 5 mana. It's a blue card, but we're gonna cycle it for 1. Boon of the Wishgiver, yet again a 6 mana card that could possibly draw us 4 cards, but we're gonna cycle it most of the time for 1 card. But this is all set up as long as our opponent doesn't remove our graveyard. This deck is actually very potent, because once you get to like 3, 4, once you get to like turn 3, 4, 5, you start getting to that point where this Zenith Flare, which is a card that deals X damage to target player, or to any target, I should say. And you gain X life for X's number of cards with cycling ability in our graveyard. So essentially, what we could do is we can get a couple, lower end threats and just start dumping cycling cards into our graveyard to pump our Zenith Flare. And if we're doing if we're attacking them aggressively and or hitting them with stingers and things like that, our opponent's gonna be like by turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, they could be down to like 10, 11, 12 life, and this Zenith Flare could actually be almost lethal damage all by itself at that point. And it's instant speed, so you can catch your opponent maybe if they try to do something at the end of your turn while they leave mana open because they think you're gonna play it. You can kind of catch them if they decide to be a little aggressive and actually hit them in the face with a Zenith Flare and gain that much life. So overall, the deck is pretty solid. I mean, it is kind of focused on one of those things. If our opponent gets rid of our graveyard, it becomes a little bit problematic on how we can actually, win the game from there. We do have cards here that do take advantage of us cycling, so maybe we can just get them low enough, and then we get into a range where even if we don't have a graveyard at that point, we can still hit them for, the things that whenever we do cycle. And I mean, right now the deck does play 20 lands, and I think that's probably a fair amount. Yet again, it's a deck that's not playing anything super expensive, but we really want to make sure we get to at least that 4 mana, if not like 5, just so we have additional room to maybe cycle a few times before we possibly pop a Zenith Flare. But overall, I mean, like I said, you can take this deck, you can splash in a little bit of blue, you can splash in a little black if you really want to play those cards. But this deck works like clockwork as long as you just focus on a few things, get your opponent down as low as possible, just kind of hit them in the face with the Zenith Flare. Just overall, it's just a deck that's pretty solid. As much as I feel like this is like the equivalent to a budget version of like mono red, just because when people see this deck, they're like, oh, this deck. So I mean, it's up to you what you guys really think of this, but I do think there's not a single rare in the deck. You could also warrant that you could put a Lurrus as a companion in the deck and get back maybe like some of your creatures, just because Lurrus works because none of our creatures are over 2 mana. With that being said, guys, if you like this video, hit that like button. It definitely helps the channel out a lot. If you're new here, want to see when I post new videos like this, hit that subscribe button. Until next time, I'll see you in the next Magic the Gathering video.